Those Days with the Monsters, Part 6. When Kirrel looked out the bridge's main viewport, his frills did not go red. Instead they turned a grim black, rising slowly like the hackles on a wolf. Not that he would have understood the metaphor. That doesn't look good. The Khuman named Happy, which Kirrel refused to attempt to pronounce without his translator, looked out at the sleek silver ship bristling with weapons. What are those things?
Tzyx.
The word slipped out of Kirrel's mouth and fell into uncomprehending silence.
Meat eaters. They like sapients. They're a cargo ship's nightmare.
He was going to die. This was it. He was going to die on a ship full of Deathworld creatures. He'd signed on at Central Core 5 for adventure, and he was going to die without a single good story to tell. This wasn't adventure. This was imminent destruction, if he was lucky. Well, shit. The captain slammed his hand onto the broadcast button. All hands on deck, boys. Reavers are real, and they're off to starboard. Kirrel didn't quite understand the reference, but it got the job done, because the entire crew was on the bridge in what couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. They had probably all been awake after that blaring alarm, but Kirrel was still reminded of their very impressive speed. The one called Happy sat down in a side seat and looked at some instruments. They're sending out a smaller ship, he called. Boarding party? Probably. Kirrel's entire neck turned black.
We're going to die.
That's enough of that line of thinking, Kirrel. The captain turned to him, his face set but not as terrified as Kirrel thought it should be. What weapons do they have?
Usually just your standard pulse rifles. Hot plasma.
How strong? Kirrel made a face.
Strong enough. Fries anyone it hits to vapor.
The captain looked grim. So we can't take it, I see. They can't eat vapor, I assume, so they use it to make some examples?
Usually, yeah.
There was a split second of silence. Then, insanely, the captain smiled. Kirrel's heart dropped. The knowledge of death had broken the Khuman already. They were doomed. Well, not any more doomed than they had been. The captain's voice shook him from his thoughts. Kirrel, how heavy are these pulse rifles?
Kirrel
thought back to the time he had had to wrangle a whole pallet of them. It had almost overloaded the hovercart.
I think each one is about 15 GS units of mass. Weight depends on gravity though.
Translation, the captain demanded, as a proximity alarm went off on the side of the ship.
Heavy.
The captain's grin turned half mad. Good. Right, boys. We're gonna play along with them as long as they don't ask us to leave the ship. We play this right, we won't lose anyone. Who wants a pulse rifle? A roar went up from the crew. Good. If you die, you don't get one. Pulse rifles go to the living, so don't die. Happy, bashful, dopey. When the rest of us move, stop their ship guns. Any means necessary will do, but try and leave some of the tech if you can. Grumpy, whatever's left is yours to play with. Grumpy bared his teeth in a demented grin. Delight. Delight? Had they all lost their minds? Kirrel's frills showed the faintest trace of red around the edges, where it wasn't quite drowned by the black.
Captain, are you insane?
Oh right, Kirrel. The captain thought for a second as the ship announced a breached airlock to starboard. You're pretty squishy, aren't you?
Squishy?
If Kirrel's frills weren't busy with his knowledge of impending doom, they would have flared orange with indignation.
What do you mean, squishy? It doesn't matter anyway. Hot plasma.
Squish is behind the rest of us. That means you're in the bag. Kirrel couldn't seem to make himself move, so the captain shoved him behind the rest of the crew. Wait for my signal, boys. He hesitated, then added, You do all have standard gear. One or two hung their heads. For the love of... Fine. If you didn't grab standard gear when I said Reavers, you count as squishy. In the bag. Kirrel found himself flanked by a pair of very embarrassed Khumans. The bridge fell silent, and they waited. Kirrel closed his inner eyelids, wishing he had been more religious so he had someone to pray to. The Tzyx marched to the bridge cautiously, as if expecting a trap. Given the captain's cockiness, Kirrel was half expecting a bulkhead to explode, or the atmosphere to vent abruptly. But the worst that happened was the Tzyx needing to cut through several bulkheads and wasting about 10 minutes. The captain pretended to be surprised as they appeared on the deck. One of the Khumans next to Kirrel made a face.
"Ugly bastards, aren't they?"
he whispered. Kirrel hoped the Tzyx couldn't hear him. They didn't seem to have picked up on it.
"Surrender!"
The Tzyx strike group's leader boomed through his throat sac. Kirrel flinched. They were louder than he'd expected. "If we do, you won't shoot my boys?" the captain asked, looking absurdly calm for the situation.
"We don't like wasting meat. Then again, we do like fear."
The leader's 7 beady eyes glinted.
"Up to you."
Kirrel was amazed the translator was working for the Tzyx. They would have to have given the galactic community a working lexicon in order for that to happen, and they weren't known as a cooperative species. His heart sank as he realised why they might have done something like that. They must like to taunt their prey. "I think I'll take not losing my boys, thanks." The captain took a deep breath as the leader of the strike group approached. Kirrel was amazed that he was able to keep his cool faced with those beady eyes, the massive vicious mandibles, the clacking carapace, the maw with its hundreds of tiny sharp teeth like a file meant to strip flesh from whatever support their prey used to hold it up.
"Get up!"
The captain stood, raising one eyebrow quizzically, his eyes pinned on one of the guards holding a pulse rifle. The Khuman called Happy shot him a keen glance, and the captain shook his head ever so slightly. Happy's lip set in a thin line that Kirrel's translator told him meant displeasure, but he said nothing. Reddish hues glittered on the deck as the strike group leader cut slightly into the captain's hand and seemed to sample his blood.
Iron and folate, those are hard to get. They'll make good breeding stock for the farms."
For the first time, the captain flinched. "Farms?"
"Quiet. Meat."
"You're disgusting." The captain's eyes glittered dangerously. Kirrel's heart pounded. For just a moment he was more afraid of the captain than of the Tzyx. Then he realised that every Khuman's head had snapped up, and all their eyes flashed the same vicious predatory gaze. Kirrel fought the urge to back away. He would only draw the attention of one or the other. He didn't want to see what the Khumans would do if he caught their attention in this terrifying state. "Sir?" Happy asked, an edge in his voice. "No," the captain commented. "I said I plan on everyone living." The Tzyx made a rattling click. Amusement. Kirrel flinched.
"For a while, of course. Even saving their lives is only temporary."
The captain took a deep breath. The strike group's leader held a pulse rifle in 2 of its 12 appendages, the deadly tip resting on the ground. Kirrel could see him glancing around at the other guards, and he tried to see what the captain was seeing. All he could see were Tzyx, eagerly eyeing them like the prey they were. "Hey, Happy. Bashful?" the captain said slowly. "Sir?" A soft hum and whir followed Happy's response as a light flickered on the ship's console. "Let's dance." The crew erupted, their gravity-induced speed pouring into their limbs. Kirrel shuddered at the animal roar they let loose. He closed both eyelids, hoping not to see the light of the pulse rifles as they went off and mowed down the insane Khumans. He wished he could close his ear holes like aquatic species could. He didn't want to hear them disintegrating. There was no sound of pulse fire. No slight light through his eyelids indicated flashes of plasma. The Khuman roar did not falter or fade away. Instead, their challenge was answered by the sound of the Tzyx dying. For a moment, Kirrel stood with both eyelids closed, frozen, unsure if he wanted to see what was happening or not. Finally, he forced them to open. He would have to report on this after all. The room was spattered with green. The Khumans would have called it yellow-green, but Kirrel couldn't tell the difference. Bits of the Tzyx were scattered everywhere, their bodies strewn over the deck. The bulkhead had closed behind them. A few ineffectual attempts at cutting through the doors had clearly been stopped before they could even provide a glimpse of hope. Happy, covered in green fluid, was sitting at his control panel, a slim blue hologram beside him. Dopey was on the other side, clattering away at a host of tiny buttons.
Captain, the guns have been neutralized.
Right, do we take their ship with us or just slag it? Grumpy raised a hand that held a primitive-looking metal blade the length of his palm and fingers. The edge dripped the same green fluid that coated the floors. I'd like to vote for taking it, at least for a bit. I want to poke at the engine. Kirrel's heart pounded violently against his ribs. The Khumans had just destroyed an entire Tzyx strike group, apparently with primitive metal blades, and they were now casually discussing the division of spoils. He would have so much to report. The very thought of trying to explain this gave him a headache.